Good evening. Good afternoon, everybody. Very good to see you here. I have the impression that maybe the noise of the lift has deterred some of us to come here. We can hear what's going on in the building. My name is Manuel and I'm the director of the Institute, as most of you will know. I just wanted to briefly say hello to everybody and say how delighted I really am to have Ben Bradford here. We were just talking earlier on that last time we met was BC, before COVID, so a long time ago in many ways. And it's great to have him here to give a talk about trustworthiness and trust in the police. I'll hand over to Bradford, who's going to introduce Ben with a few more words. Before I leave, just one other thing with questions. We would like to continue this model also for those who are joining us online, whereby we ask the questions using Slido. So you can just type Slido into your phone, then the Slido window comes up, you type 4623154 into the field. This is not a prisoner number, it's just a number that is needed to get to the right event. You would have to write this down because this screen, of course, is going to disappear. Either you log in now or you write it down on a piece of paper, and then you can write down your question. The more questions we have, the better it is. Please do just keep writing questions. Don't wait until the end of the presentations. As Ben is talking and Justice is commenting on the presentation, please keep asking questions. That's going to make for more interesting conversation afterwards. And then you can write the questions. So any question that comes up, and you think this is a really interesting question, you can like it, you can't unlike it. So you can't hate a question and think this is a really stupid question, I don't want this question. So that's the rules of the game. Barack, over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Thursday night series. We're quite happy to have Ben Bradford here with us. He's a world expert in different areas. He's done so much, so I'm going to try to be as brief as I can to give you more time to present. He's a professor of global city policing at the Department of Security and Crime Science. He's also director of the Institute of Global City Policing, which is an interesting initiative which is being funded by UCL, the Metropolitan Police Service, and the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. And we're trying to promote research in policing in London and other places as well, as you can see. You have many research interests, so it's always a pleasure to have you here and to hear a glimpse of the things that you do. You work on public trust, on police legitimacy, cooperation, and compliance in justice settings, and social identity is a factor in all these processes. Without further ado, we're looking forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad, and thanks, Manuel, and thanks very much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here. And welcome to all those people joining online. I'm still not used to this hybrid format, so I hope it won't be horribly wrong. Right, first thing I've got to do is find the mouse. Get out of here. No, that's not right. That's right. There we go. And hopefully this works well. Right. Yes, okay. So I thought I wouldn't possibly normally have done this in this kind of context, but I thought I'd talk about one specific paper that I've been working on with my colleagues, John Jackson, Christina Murphy, Tina Murphy, and Elise Sargent. And this is part of a wider project that I had with, that Tina had, and I did a little tiny bit of work on, and with Elise looking at policing immigrant communities in Australia. And the reason why I chose to do one paper is I think this paper sums up quite a few interesting things in one place, as it were, and it says quite a lot about the kind of work that we're doing at the moment. So hopefully that will come off. Who knows? Anyway, so I want to do four things. I think about half an hour, 35 minutes. Is that about right? Let's very briefly start with the motivation for this paper, and it's a motivating puzzle. And then I'm going to talk about what that puzzle motivated in us, which is thinking about the distance, the gap between the difference between trust and trustworthiness. And then I've got some data from Sydney, Australia, it's the pictures, that speak to this gap and to explain what might be going on, why we think it's interesting. And then at the end, there are a few implications, and hopefully the discussion will raise some questions among you, because I think there's some quite big issues kind of bubbling under the surface of this, and that'd be nice to try and surface. So the motivating puzzle is this. So obviously the policing of immigration is a hugely contentious subject, and not actually one I want to particularly get dragged into here, though. It's really important to understand that it's under the surface, again, to use that phrase, it's under the surface of lots of things I'm going to be saying. It's how the difficult relationship there often is between police and immigrant communities in many contexts around the world, and also, of course, the contentious issue about policing immigration itself. We need to recognise that that's all here somewhere. What's perhaps less well known, I think, about the relationship between police and immigrants is that across multiple contexts, certainly in the global north, immigrants seem to have more favourable views of the police than their non-immigrant counterparts. There's quite a number of studies now suggesting this when we take minority or racialized status into account. So if you control for race, control for ethnicity, immigrants tend to have more favourable views of the police than non-immigrants. And that seems kind of counterintuitive, I think, sometimes. I mean, one of the reasons why it seems counterintuitive is because we spend a lot of time talking about the difficult relationship between police and communities, and particularly the reluctance among many immigrant communities in a place like the UK, in a place like Australia, to engage with the police, to cooperate with the police, to come forward and report crime, and so forth. So that's the puzzle. So there seems to be a gap here between positive perceptions on average among some immigrant communities, or many immigrant communities in countries of the global north, what we might call trustworthiness, I'll explain why we might call it that in a minute, and trust in the police among those same communities. Suggest that trust, in line with a kind of increasingly dominant conceptualization of trust, as a willingness to be vulnerable. So you have more positive perceptions on one hand, and a lower level of trust, a lower willingness to be vulnerable to police on the other. And that's the gap, that's the space, if you like, I want to think about. So I need to define what we mean by trust. I've just started that. We used to think, I certainly used to think about trust in ways, broadly speaking, in line with what Hardin says here. To say we trust you believes you have the right intentions towards us and you're competent to do what we trust you to do. And I still think that's important, but I would now call that trustworthiness, perceptions of trustworthiness. This dominant conceptualization of trust, which is really, really helpful. By no means it's not me. It comes from Mayer and colleagues and a number of people working since the 1990s and possibly before that. And you can define trust in these kinds of terms. So people who trust criminal justice institutions, people who trust the police, are willing to rely upon, give control to, or otherwise be vulnerable to those institutions under conditions of risk. In other words, to trust someone means that you place something that you value in their hands, and that would be the crime you just reported, as an obvious example. And you do that under conditions of risk because you don't know what they're going to do with that thing you've given them to deal with. Another great example of trust is leaving your children with a babysitter. Give them something really, really valuable, children, and you don't know, you can't know what they're going to do. But your willingness to trust, your willingness to make yourself vulnerable to this trust, the trustee in these kinds of contexts, is premised on your evaluations and expectations about their current and future behaviour. And those evaluations and expectations revolve around ideas of competency, benevolence, integrity. If you evaluate the police to be competent, benevolent, fair, to behave with integrity, if you think they currently behave like that, you form an expectation that they would behave like that in the future. You form a positive expectation, you're willing to be vulnerable to them because you think they're going to do the right thing, produce an appropriate outcome if you give them something that you value. And again, that thing could be the crime you've experienced, it could just be your safety in a much wider sense. It could be about empowering the police to make decisions about what to do with crime and disorder in your community. As an important aside, and we'll come back to this later, I think if you see trust in those terms, I think it's incredibly useful in policing to do that. We're talking about both the potential future behaviour of specific actors, both actors that you know, you're interacting with in the here and now, as it were, and specific people who might turn up to deal with your crime or whatever it is. And it's also wrapping up beliefs about role holders, a kind of abstract understanding of the police and the figure of the police officer. Because we're in a survey context, I think it's more abstract and institutional trust is more what we're talking about. But it's really important to understand it's always a dialogue with trust and individual police officers and what you think individual police officers might do should you interact with them. So vulnerability and risk are central to trust, and as I've kind of suggested, it's easy to see why that's so relevant in policing context, because we're all at risk of harm from breaches of trust by the police, whether those breaches are voluntary or involuntary. So this is a quote from Joseph Hammond, colleagues. Joseph Hammond been doing a lot of work on this in recent years, and it's really useful. So vulnerability refers to the potential for harms that run from concrete individual injury, didn't solve the crime, used you when they turned up, to more nebulous psychological harms that can affect larger segments of society. So communities and even society as a whole can be harmed by the breaches of trust at the hands of the police. Regarding the police, vulnerability most obviously includes potential for justified personal harms, ranging from getting a ticket or being arrested, it's harmful to the individual if it isn't to anyone else, to, and more interestingly, more importantly, unjustifiable harms such as experiencing excessive violence, bias, and disrespect at the hands of the police. So this is what we are at risk of when we engage with the police. This is what we can't know they might do. This is why this willing vulnerability idea is so important. Just very quickly, I think we probably all know this, but trust is really important. It does lots of useful stuff for individuals, for society, for the police themselves. As I've kind of suggested, it encourages, it motivates action. Reporting crime, most obviously. People are more likely to engage themselves in informal social control activity if they trust the police, if they believe police will turn up and help them if needed. So there's a really consistent link, I think, between trusting the police and willingness to engage in the kind of activities that underpin collective efficacy. That seems to be a very consistent finding. Justice and other people have done work looking at trusting the police and associated concepts, how they're linked to propensities to engage in self-help or vigilante violence. If you're confronted with a problem of crime, if you distrust the police, you're more likely to turn to vigilantes and to deal with that problem because you don't think they're going to do anything useful for you. There's no point in making themselves vulnerable to them because they're not going to help or they're incompetent or whatever it is. Of course, trust in institutions, and this might be particularly important in the context of immigration, of course, trust in institutions is also linked in kind of Anthony Giddens' sense to people's sense of belonging, inclusion, ontological security, a kind of secure sense of belonging within the social context in which we live. It's much easier to have that sense of secure belonging if you trust institutions such as the police. And of course, and this is the flip side, we may want to think about this in a bit more detail, you can have too much trust, right? Because people who trust the police are willing to grant police extra powers, since they believe those powers are not going to be abused almost by definition, and there may be a sense in which you can be too trusting, or too willing to give them extra powers. So we all want in any of these kind of conversations to think this is just a slope that can go on forever. We do at a point, there's a tipping point. We want to retain a critical edge in our trust judgments. So trust is willingness to be vulnerable under conditions of risk. That's premise and expectations and evaluations of competency and good intentions. Expectations and evaluations, that's trustworthiness. And in trust literature, as I've mentioned, I've talked about ability, benevolence, integrity, openness and transparency, these kinds of ideas. According to the kind of classic trust model developed by Mayer, trustworthiness, trust is also based rather in propensities to trust. So trustworthiness, that leads to trust. Propensities to trust also leads to trust. Some people are just more trusting than others for a whole host of psychological, sociological reasons. For example, you're brought up in a context that's more or less trusting, you're just more trusting, and that applies to an institution such as the police. And I'll to those two, so trust comes from trustworthiness, it comes from propensities to trust. It also comes fundamentally, I think, from group membership. Trust is foundationally and fundamentally about relationships. So you're always thinking when you're making your trust judgments, who am I, who are they, we share a group, or from different groups, so that our group relations maintained appropriately or inappropriately. You can't get away from the kind of groupiness of these kinds of judgments. And again, I'll come back to that. So what makes police trustworthy? And this is the gap, right? So you've got more positive evaluations among immigrants. You may have lower levels of trust among immigrants, speaking very generally, of course. You can say it's ability, you can say it's benevolence, you can say it's integrity, but I'd want to be more specific. I think it's helpful to be more specific. It may also be the case that ability, benevolence, integrity apply to individuals. We need to think about the institution as well. So I think when we're thinking about what makes a police trustworthy, we can work with some very familiar concepts. We can work with the concept of effectiveness. We can work with concepts of distributive justice and fairness, of the distribution of the goods and impositions of policing across different groups in society. We can think about boundary authority and whether Richard and Tom Tyler have been developing, the sense that police do or do not stay within appropriate boundaries of their activity. And we can think, of course, about procedural justice. And there's loads and loads and loads of research which suggests that procedural justice is the most important factor for trust, as it is for so many other outcomes as well. So to summarize what I've been saying, trust comes from trustworthiness, it comes from propensity to trust. There's an inherent groupiness about this, but there seems to be a gap among immigrant communities where we can hypothesize this gap. There's something getting in the way of that top paragraph. There's something getting in the way of positive evaluations of the police, trustworthiness, and trust, a willingness to be vulnerable to policing. So in this paper, I want to think about what some of those things are. Not in a particularly formal sense, and then there's going to really complicated mediation or moderation analysis here. I just want to think about some of the factors that may interrupt, prevent trustworthiness from translating into trust. And what might those be among immigrant communities? Well, in some sense, I've kind of alluded to some of these already, but just to specify, I think there are at least 5 things, maybe many more, of course, but the 5 things that I've kind of thought of for this paper is first and perhaps most fundamentally, and actually something we can't address in this paper because we've only got immigrants. Immigrants have exposure to police in different contexts. So their judgment of policing is always inherently comparative. And for one of the reasons why people suggest that many immigrants in countries in the global north from the global south have more positive views of policing, it's because they're comparing the police in countries such as Australia or Britain with police in their countries of origin, more corrupt, less efficient, less benevolent, less integrity, etc., etc. So I think that's definitely going to be here. We can't address it in this paper because everyone in the paper is immigrants. What else might shape the trustworthiness judgments of immigrants in particular? Well, and everyone, I'll come back to that. You're going to get social variation in the norm to trust or distrust in a general sense. Some populations, some communities, some societies are just more or less trusting than others. We know there's cross-national variation, and of course within countries there's going to be community level variation in just the general norm to trust that people have. You're also going to get specific group norms about relations with the police. So within some social groups, in any context, there's going to be a relatively more or less strong norm not to engage with the police, not to trust the police. So obvious examples in the UK, which is around traveller communities, some black communities, the norm in those communities is distrust the police. And that's a social norm, it's a characteristic of that community. You might also want to think about experience of discrimination in destination and country, which is often obviously experienced by immigrant groups. And this is where we start getting into the idea of thinking about trust in terms of risk. If you've experienced discrimination at the hands of individuals or institutions or groups within the society that you live, engaging with other institutions seems more risky because of the discrimination you've experienced in the past. And of course, in policing context, in any context, that group, that institution you've experienced discrimination from may well have been the police itself. Just as increasing your risk, it's more risky to me. So what's happened to me, what's happened to my friends and families in the past. And finally, another factor which we kind of take into account, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about in this presentation, is neighbourhood effect. So we know that the neighbourhood has a massive effect on people's judgments and evaluations of policing. Across London, there's huge, for example, there's huge variation by neighbourhood in people's propensity relatively, for people's propensities to trust the police, to legitimise them, etc. For a whole host of reasons we can get into if you want. And we also know, of course, that immigrants select and are selected into different areas. So any of the kind of relations that we're looking at may be confounded by the types of areas in which people live and the judgments they make by different types of areas in which they live. Really important point here, 2 to 5 are not unique to immigrant communities. Anyone in any society, and any individual could experience some or all of these factors themselves. Any group may be experiencing some or all of these factors themselves. So immigrants in this case, immigrants living in Sydney, Australia, is kind of an example. We could make the argument that some of these are more visible in immigrant communities, but then by no means unique to them. It's just a place to go and look to see what's going on. So these are research questions, hopefully make some kind of sense now. So we're interested in what the immigrant experience, if I can call it that, of policing has to say about the potential gap between positive perceptions, trustworthiness, and willingness to engage with, be vulnerable to the police, the space between trustworthiness and trust. And we've got 3 specific questions here. Are there personal, social, and neighbourhood characteristics They're associated with individuals' trust in the police. They're independent of evaluations of police trustworthiness and individual propensity to trust. So in the same way that if that the propensity to trust under the classic model predicts trust independent of evaluations of trustworthiness, and evaluations of trustworthiness predict trust independent of propensity to trust, are there other factors inserting themselves into this kind of relationship? We're going to focus on the things I've just said: perceived norms of trust and support the police, attitudes towards authority, which probably blurs over into propensities to trust, experiences of discrimination, and neighbourhood structural characteristics. Second question: to what extent are any differences in trust between individual groups accounted for by either variations in perceptions of trustworthiness and all these other personal, social, and cultural factors? We're not, of course, not assuming that all immigrant groups have the same level of trust in the police. If there are differences, what can we explain those differences? And can we explain those differences by some shown on this slide? And then finally, is the link between trustworthiness and trust consistent across immigrant groups, or does it vary? Do you need more trustworthiness to trust in some parts of the population than in others? So the study site is Sydney. This is a Sydney immigrant community survey exploring experiences of policing among 3 immigrant groups living in and around Sydney in Australia, people of Middle Eastern, UK and Vietnamese backgrounds. Those groups were, of course, chosen deliberately for this study, and specifically Middle Eastern Muslims, usually from Lebanon, have a history of policing, with policing in Australia, but as in so many other cases, stretches back to 9/11, the war on terror, and lots of negative things that happened in the aftermath of that. The Vietnamese community in Australia have a longer problematic relationship with the police. It goes back to the 70s, when people were arriving during and after the Vietnam War, and there was this whole series of moral panics about the Vietnamese community in Australia, drug dealing gangs, etc., etc. So these are deliberately chosen communities who have a history with policing in some sense. The UK group are kind of like a control group. It's actually quite difficult to sample them because they just blend in to the general population in Australia. But comparing the UK with the Middle Eastern and Vietnamese groups, I think is really instructive. That's what I'm going to be spending what I'm doing. Just characteristic of the sample. Well, more to say, there's some limitations here. So all respondents were citizens, which isn't as much of a problem as you might expect. It's a limitation. The Middle Eastern and Vietnamese respondents were sampled using an ethnic surname strategy and a quota to get the numbers right, and also demographic quotas as well. The UK group, because the surname strategy wouldn't work in Australia, because there's lots of people called Smith and Jones and Clue and all this kind of stuff, just snowballing outreach something, just to see groups in areas where they thought might be a lot of UK immigrants hanging around. So there's a caution here of representativeness. And then the response rate, such as it means anything, is not actually too bad. I'm not sure it means about 42%. So the first thing we want to do is what do we mean by trustworthiness, and does it work in this survey? So this is a kind of a graphic summarising second-order latent variable model, second-order confirmatory factor analysis. But the first-order constructs, before I introduce procedural justice, distributive justice, bounded authority, effectiveness, procedural justice will measured in exactly the standard kind of way. Distributive justice: Australian police unfairly target people like you because of your race, ethnicity, or religion, those kinds of questions. Bounded authority: police often act as if they were above the law, those kinds of questions. Effectiveness: how effective are the police at solving those kinds of questions. That's fine. First order confirmatory factor analysis worked really well, as it always does. The second order latent construct is trustworthiness. That's predicting, in a sense, all these first order constructs, and it worked really, really well as well. So the standardized factor loadings were between about 0.75 and 0.85, 0.9. There's a really strong set of second order construct that's explaining variation in these first order constructs. I think it's not unreasonable to call that trustworthiness. And then trustworthiness on a pairwise basis is really strongly correlated with trust, and we measure trust. I'm happy to accept the ability of police to intervene in people's lives. I'm comfortable allowing the police to decide how best to deal with the problems of crime and disorder. I'm happy making myself vulnerable to police. I'm happy letting them make decisions that affect my lives. You get the kind of thing. We also saw really significant variation, as I think you might expect, in levels of trust and trustworthiness across the groups. So the UK group were more trusting of the police. They were more willing to place trust in the police. They had more favourable evaluations of the trustworthiness of police than the other two groups. They also had stronger norms of trust. So we measured norms of trust with how many people in Australia with your ancestry do you think have trust and confidence in the Australian police, support the actions of the Australian police, and this is the UK group here, really strongly trusted around the Mavericks, really strongly trusted. And on that basis, there's a stronger norm to trust the police within the UK group. And just as a side, we also had individual propensities to trust the police, just so you know how we measured them. That's only, but most people can be trusted. Most people trust them by the kind of classic measures of generalized social trust. And then what we did, I mean, this is probably a bad idea. It's always a bad idea to show regression results on a slide, but I didn't really think how else to do it. So what we did is built a whole series of random effects model with the level 2 variable suburb. Suburb in Australia is a kind of meaningful unit. All Australians are aware of which suburb they live in. It's part of their identity. It's too big. It's just too big to pick up neighbourhood effects, and we didn't pick up any effects. And we started off with a basic model that just had immigrant group and generation. Control for generation, first and second, that never did anything interesting. And that just represents this finding that the Middle Eastern and Vietnamese groups had lower levels of trust than the UK group. There's variation between these two groups. If you like, want to call them that, non-white groups had lower levels of trust than the UK group. And then we added variables stepwise to see what happened to those coefficients. So the first variables we added were neighbourhood characteristics, didn't think. That's fairly consistent in Australia. Neighbourhood doesn't seem to be particularly important in Australia, I think because it's not measured particularly well. But the coefficients for the two different in-group groups stayed the same. Then we added personal characteristics, age, gender, etc. Some of those were significant, some of those weren't, had no effect on the difference between the two groups whatsoever. So the personal characteristics, the composition of the groups, if you like, isn't changing the group relationship with the police, at least as it's represented, and by a measure of trust. We then added trustworthiness and propensity to trust, the kind of classic Mayer model. And unsurprisingly, odd in some senses, we found a really strong correlation between trustworthiness and trust. So people who had positive evaluations of procedural justice, boundary authority, distributive justice effectiveness, they were much more likely to say they trusted the police. Propensity to trust, nothing really. In fact, it's one of those weird nuisance coefficients that's going in the wrong direction when you take everything else into account, but it's very, very small. So trusting the police on this basis is all about trustworthiness, not about propensity to trust. And that makes perfect sense to me. Propensity to trust is about trusting other people. This is an institution, and a very, very specific institution of a particular kind. It would seem quite odd, I think, that your propensity to trust individual people had a big effect in this context. We then added the other variables I've been talking about. And this is where it gets really interesting. So you can see in this model, when we added trustworthiness, the difference between the groups shrunk. Those coefficients are smaller, they're closer to 0, but they haven't shrunk by a huge amount. There's still group differences. In other words, if you take someone from, take the group, or if you take the individuals from the Middle East and the UK group with the same level, same perceptions of police trustworthiness, the person from the Middle Eastern group is going to have a much lower level of trust, a significantly lower level, given the same trustworthiness evaluation. Then we added the other variables: norms of trust, societal discrimination, authoritarian attitudes, and contact with the police, just because that seemed like something we should be taking into account somewhere. And what's really interesting here, now the coefficients for Middle East and Vietnamese have shrunk again. They're still significant, though. They're still significantly different to 0 or negative. So even when taking into account all these other variables in the model, people from the Middle East and Vietnamese groups still had average lower levels of trust than people from the UK group. What's also really interesting in this model is how strong the norm of trust measure is. Standardized coefficient, I think it is standardized actually for 0.5. That's quite large. Take it from me, that's quite large in this context. So probably for everyone else, dependent of your own demographics, and most importantly, your own evaluations of the trustworthiness of police. If you believe that other people in your community trust the police, you are much more likely to say that you trust the police as well. If you believe that other people in your community didn't trust the police, you're much less likely to say you trust the police, independent of your evaluations of procedural justice, distributive justice, etc., etc. We also found quite a strong association between authoritarian attitudes and trust in the police. So again, and most crucially, controlling for your own evaluations of the trustworthiness of the police. If you're a more authoritarian-minded individual, which I think we measured by questions like children should be taught strong authority in school, people who go to prison for longer, those kinds of things. If you're more authoritarian in those kinds of ways, you're more likely to say trusted. This is about your relationship with authority and the value you place on your relationship with authority if you're a more authoritarian person. And of course, your willingness to accept what authority does is there if you've got a more authoritarian mindset. I'm also interested in this model, the coefficient for trustworthiness is shrunk by quite a lot, really quite a lot. So in this model, if we take into account these other factors, which we expect to vary across immigrant groups and individual groups and across society more generally, the link between trustworthiness and trust is attenuated to a significant degree. It's still there, but it's a lot smaller than it was before. So these things are precisely inserting themselves in the relationship between trustworthiness and trust. They're altering the way that relationship plays out. And finally, to check whether the association between trustworthiness and trust was constant or variable across groups, we tested interactions. Those interactions can be summarized with this slide. Trustworthiness was a stronger predictor of trust for the UK group compared to the Middle Eastern and Vietnamese groups. UK individuals were paying more attention, if you like, to their evaluations of the police when they're thinking about whether they trusted the police than people in the Middle Eastern and Vietnamese groups. It wasn't a big difference, but it was definitely there. So again, there's group membership is interrupting, doing something to what you might otherwise think as a hydraulic relationship between trustworthiness and trust. You might assume you just increase trustworthiness, you increase trust. Your group membership is doing something to that kind of relationship. So what does all that mean? Well, group level differences in trust persist even after we take perceptions of trustworthiness and actually all those other variables into account. So collective experiences matter here in ways that transcend all the variables included in that model. Well, but of course, there might be other variables that we're missing. As I just said, people from the Middle East and Vietnamese groups needed a more positive, another way of saying what I just said rather in terms of the interaction, is that people from the Middle East and Vietnamese groups needed a more positive evaluation of trustworthiness of the police before they were willing to take the risk to trust. Which another way of saying that is trusting the police might seem more risky to people from those groups because of their history with policing. If trust seems more risky, you need a more positive evaluation of trustworthiness to enable you to think it's okay to take that risk. People's understanding of community norms are really, really important, at least as much as we can assess them with this kind of modelling. Of course, there are limitations there. But it certainly seems to be the case that people are paying quite a lot of attention to what they think other people in their community are about. That's important for them when they're forming their trust judgments. And as I've kind of suggested, I think all of that sums together this kind of idea that individual and collective experiences might inhibit in some way the translation of trustworthiness into trust, inhibit the translation of what you think the police are doing into your willingness to make yourself vulnerable to the police. I think this is really interesting for a number of reasons. I think putting the concept of risk right back at the centre of trust, and this is not me saying this, lots of people, people have been saying this for a number of years now. I think we should pay much more attention to that. Most obviously because different individuals, as we've seen, are kind of suggested different groups, evaluate risks in different ways. And the way that they evaluate risks is going to be affecting their relationship with the police. And that evaluation may be to do with their relationship with the police, but it may be due to much wider factors as well. I think the Sarah Everard case is a really interesting potential. I'd be interested in what people think about this. Example of this, because I think what happened in the immediate aftermath of the Sarah Everard case is trusting the police just became more risky for people, and that it did so in a very quick and rapid way as knowledge of that case spread. And there's a kind of fundamental shift in people's attitudes towards policing that kind of escapes their evaluations of organisational performance. It wasn't about whether today I've woken up and I think the police are less effective, fair, etc., and I thought yesterday it just now seems more risky for me to trust the police, particularly for women. Of course, one implication of that might be further down the line, we need to reverse the error of causality. So now I think that trusting the police is more risky. Well, why do I think that? Well, perhaps that's because actually they're not as fair as I thought they were effective. So the relationship between trust and trustworthiness may not only be just trustworthiness to trust, but the other way as well. And most obviously in the context of immigration, people in more marginal and dangerous situations, like women in the aftermath of the Sarah Everard case, but more specifically in the context as well, are likely to see significant risk in contact or collaboration with the police. For example, in situations where the police are collaborating with immigration enforcement authorities. And what they need to take the leap of faith to trust the police, leap of faith, Mollering's term, think about trust, it's based on the leap of faith, because you don't know what the police are going to do if you summon them or whatever. The extent to which people's difficult and dangerous situation in relation to police, in relation to society more generally, is going to say something about their willingness and how appropriate it is for them to take that leap of faith. And then that idea about your position in relation to the police and what they represent is not well covered in our current understandings of the way we think about measuring attitudes to police, pursuit, etc., etc. There's much more going on. And finally, I think this is my last slide. I think some of the other lessons for that, it might be more kind of practical lessons for police organisations and others who want to increase public trust in the police, which we spend a huge amount of time thinking about, very obviously at the moment in the aftermath of Sarah Everard, a number of other cases in London, for example. We absolutely need to attend to the trustworthiness of police, trying to increase public trust. We need to attend to procedural justice, distributive justice, boundary authority, effectiveness, integrity. We need to think about all these things. Police need to do these things, they need to communicate these things, and we as academics study need to be aware of what people think about these things. But we also need to pay much more attention, I think, to group and community experiences. And that's always proven difficult. It's proven difficult for police to engage with communities in a meaningful way. And it's proven difficult for academics, I think, certainly as for me, to think about what that means in the context of the kind of work we do. How can we really meaningfully take community and collective experience of policing into account? I don't think we're particularly good at that at the moment. And just as a final plea, we need to measure things much more precisely. And this is a plea to myself and many of us working in this field. We're constantly talking about trust in the police and then measuring the right trustworthiness, or using these very high-level questions: how good a job do the police do there? And assuming that kind of means anything in particular. It might be a good indicator, but as we've shown, there's lots and lots of stuff going under the surface that you're missing if you're not asking the right questions in the right kind of context to the right kinds of people. So that's all I had to say. I've got questions, but I think I'm going to hand over to Justice now.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the paper, which you gracefully forwarded to me. Enjoyed reading it. Known Ben for quite some time now. Really enjoy the kind of work that you do, the blend of theory and empirical work in the way that I think is quite insightful. I agree with quite a lot of what you have to say, but I just thought I would make a couple of observations, which I hope would contribute to whatever discussions that we want to have. And the first of these arises from a comment made in the paper about the shared histories and identities of migrant communities. And certainly, there's a lot of cultural, historical, even material experiences of migrant communities that are shared. But of course, that also hides quite a lot of heterogeneity in these groups. And I wondered whether you thought that an intersectional perspective might contribute to try to understand this, because people are not just migrants from Vietnamese society or from the Middle East. They are also of particular social class, they are particular gender, and so forth. And this actually struck me when I first came to the UK. and had some friends in London. They were third generation migrants, and the way that they spoke about the police was quite strange to me initially. Because here I was in Cambridge, never really had any experiences with the police. Twice they stopped me about not wearing the helmet and so forth, but they were just saying sorry and then they let you go. But what they were talking about in London was just a history of harassment and discrimination, especially of young Black or Black men. So, and of course, what we learn from intersectional perspectives is how these different identities intersect to create, as some say, interlocking hierarchies, which might mean that different people experience policing, perceive policing differently. So that was the first thought that I said I would highlight. The second, maybe follows from that a little bit, is this, I think, distinction we have to make between identities and then people's structural positions. So again, somebody might be a young Black man, but a young Black man with a different sense of being included materially, politically, socially in society. And so there is that dimension as well. So in a sense, I wondered whether you thought a focus not so much on the identity as in from the Middle East or from Vietnam or from wherever it is, but in terms of the level of inclusion or exclusion that individuals might experience or feel might be one way that we can begin to think about some of these issues. The third point I thought I would highlight is the way that trust might mean different things to different people in a sense. And what's interesting, watching the funeral ceremony or whatever you want to call it yesterday of Tyree Nichols and so forth. And Reverend our captain was saying that this same group of 5 police officers would go to one neighborhood and will never dream of doing what they did to this gentleman in that particular neighborhood. But then in another neighborhood, they behave the way that they did. Which suggests that maybe for a person in that neighborhood where the police are really nice, historically, they've been really polite, they don't do that kind of things, trust becomes a little bit instinctive, right? And that's what I mean by like this disposition. Like your natural tendency is to trust the police. It's almost like a duty. Why would you not call the police? I mean, you want to debate not calling the police. That's just like it's your duty to do that. That's your instinct, right? As opposed to those who have had a history of police harassment, of course, colonialism, racism, and so forth. Trust becomes a little bit more contingent, right? Even much more deeply contingent than probably for other groups. And so, I mean, I want to get the notion of like disposable trust in that sense. So you have particular needs at particular time, and that's when, and it's interesting when you were talking about these groups as maybe not so much an issue of trustworthiness, at particular times when they have some concerns and whether they got. And that reminded me of Matthew Desmond's work on, so he studied a group of families in the US, white people living in very poor neighborhoods, facing eviction, and the way that they struggle to survive in this environment. He talks about the way that they build relationship, and that this way, as he described it, disposable relationship, they were formed for particular needs of survival at a particular time, and that they quickly moved on to other relationships. And it often seems to me that when you're talking about minority groups, some minority groups, this is the nature of the relationship that they have with it. It's quite disposable in that sense. And that is certainly, at least from the standpoint of the police, that's not good enough. They want much more durable relationship of trust and so forth. And of course, especially when we talk about the US and other places, one thing we know is that there is this environment of cynicism towards them. So when I'm talking about this disposable trust, but yet we also know that they do call it sometimes. So the question arises as to how we deal with that current conflict. That on the one hand we distrust them, on the other hand we sometimes call them. And here again, I find Monica Bell's work on situational trust really interesting, and I think it would be something worth considering. So her point is that very much like the notion of this disposable trust or trust that requires contingent. Her point is that these 50 or so women, African-American women that she studied, in spite of the cynicism, they create what she calls moments of trust, right? They develop these strategies that allow them to, on the one hand, maintain the generalized cynicism towards the police, and yet sometimes call them. So she talks, for example, about officer exceptionalism as one strategy. So here, a distinction is made between the police officer and the institution. So when you were talking about trust in the police and so far, I was just wondering whether people will think about the institution or they'll think about particular officers that they know. And her argument here is that for many of them, yes, the institution is corrupt, it's crooked and all that. But Officer Joe, we know him in our neighborhood, he's quite, as some people say, he's quite correct, right? And so forth. So that allows them to, so the trust will be in that particular officer to intervene in situations rather than, as it were, the generalized institution. The second strategy she talks about is this idea of domain, she calls domain specificity. So instances or situations that people consider the police to be much more effective than others. And I think it's, again, not a novel idea. Honora O'Neill talks about trust being quite situational. It's always important that we think about it that way. And one example, interesting example she often gives is that, well, she might trust the school driver to take her children to school, but will not trust him to teach them arithmetic or whatever that they might do. So one example she used, for example, is that for many of these mothers that she studied, they would trust the police when they're dealing with, for example, domestic incidents. That when it's in the home or near the home, the police are much more reliable. But when it's something much more in the public space, in the streets, completely hopeless. Right. The third is what she calls therapeutic consequences. So this is where people think that at this particular moment, if we were to call the police, there would be some beneficial consequences. So they might know a family member or a friend who is experiencing domestic violence. They themselves don't want to call the police, but because they care so much about those individuals, they want to call the police on their behalf and so forth. And then, of course, last one being what she calls institutional navigation. So again, interested in the specific case that she talks about. These are women living in public housing, sometimes at the risk of being evicted, especially if something happens in that place. And so to try to have some leverage over the local housing authority, it's better that if something happens, you call the police, so that they will come in, have a formal record of what is happening, they will listen to your side of the story, and hopefully that allows you to have some leverage, or to protect you from that agency. And of course, sometimes this is that because the police have a lot of information about other institutions, getting them involved means that you are able to navigate that institutional space with that information much more than you would on your own. And there are two reasons I think this study is important for the way we think about trust and especially policy implications. And I like, of course, the conclusion you draw that for policymakers, the issues are really complex, and one needs to think carefully about it. A couple of things. First of all, that it's a study that shows us how qualitative methods can enrich our understanding of trust, right? Because this is something that we possibly would not have picked from designing surveys and asking people to tick boxes the way that we traditionally do in our studies of trust. So I think here there's maybe some, I'm sure you would agree, that diversifying our methodological portfolio will be really important in getting a better grasp of why and how people trust the police and so forth. The second, of course, is that, at least from the standpoint of institutions or police managers, how do we move from this moment of trust to something more of a durable, trusting relationship with the public? And that's a huge challenge, right? How do we move from the particular to the general? How do you get people to think not just of Officer Joe as being exceptionally good, but to think of that from that generalized experience of thinking about the institution itself as of course, the third issue I wanted to say was something that you ended with, which was that should people really be trusting the police? Is it a healthy thing to trust them? What would that healthy trust look like? Certainly for people who are instinctively trusting of the police, you might lose guard of issues of accountability, monitoring, and so forth, right? Because if you think about this vulnerability notion that you're talking about, and trusting me that you essentially, some will say you stop worrying, right? You know that they will deal with the issues without being alert to questions of accountability. I think it's very much looking. Of course, institutions want to be trusted, but should we be trusting them? In what situations should we be trusting them? And someone said, well, trust but verify. How can we create those structures that will allow us to hold police to account? So as I said, I entirely like the theoretical and arguments that you make, but I just thought I would highlight a couple of these issues for discussion. Thank you.
Should I, I've got, yeah, thanks. Yeah, that was really small. That was great. Yeah, no, I agree. Everything that he just said. Let me think about things that are triggering when you were saying. So the structural position, I'll start at the end while it's fresh in my mind. So I think one of the things I struggle with slightly with that definition of trust that I've just been pushing is that in some of the kinds of situations that Justice was talking about, and Insa Cock writes this in her ethnography of the housing estate in East Oxford, near where I used to live actually, where she talks about people invoking the police to solve their own problems. So if they're having a neighbour dispute, what they'll do is they'll think of a reason for calling the police and set the police on their neighbours. Now, in that moment, they're making themselves vulnerable to the police, right? Because the police turn up, the police might turn up and say, well, they're not doing anything wrong, but I can see you're up to no good. And they're making themselves willingly vulnerable to the police. So that means they trust the police. Right? So in some senses, that seems like a big ask to me. That doesn't seem like an appropriate use of the word trust. I think the argument would be, we go back to risk. It's about a risk evaluation. I know how, in some senses, the way you were saying, I know how to play this game. I have a lot to do with the police. I understand what my risk is in relation to the police. The risk of me them doing something to me that I don't like is offset and less than the benefit I'm going to get from setting them on my neighbours. So I think the argument would be that that is trust, but I struggle with that slightly. That seems like a misuse of the word. I think that's really, really interesting. All the points you're making, I really agree. I think the idea of structural location is really important. And again, we underplay it. And I think because it's quite difficult to kind of get at. But if you live in if you occupy a structural position in a society, such that you learn the lesson that you're not valued, that the society doesn't care about it, all your opportunities. You've by that structure, high levels of unemployment, poor access to schools, whatever it be. It just seems like obvious that you're going to trust institutions such as the police that and less than you might otherwise do, because they're caught up with this failure that you're experiencing. And we do find some evidence of that. I don't think we look really hard enough for that kind of evidence, or think really clearly enough about what it means. And of course, it's complicated by the fact that the police are involved in your exclusion, your marginalisation. They're not separate things, they're linked in multiple ways. So who you are, where you sit in society, can be really foundational importance, kinds of things we're talking about. And the last point I wanted to make in response to that while I was thinking was, intersectionality. Yeah, absolutely right. We need to be very clear that in some senses, all of that was a statistical artifact. In some senses, it makes sense to say, as I did at the beginning, that we can separate out the immigrant experience and the experience of being an ethnic or other minority. That's just like a pretty crazy thing to say that you can do. It might be analytically useful, and hopefully it was, but we need to remember all these things throughout each other and layer on top of each other in lots of interesting and often really profoundly disturbing ways. So the mere fact that I'm friends with a bunch of statistical artifacts, we should lose sight of the kind of the reality that underpins that, even in concepts like Bradford. Australia. And the other thing I was going to say, is I think the study as a whole underplays the importance of neighbourhood context and that kind of local lived experience, both because I don't think we've got very good measures of it, and also because it's Australia. And Australia is just weird. I don't know if you've been to Australia, you drive from suburb to suburb, they all look the same. And everyone knows where this is such and such a suburb, this is such a, but as an outside, quite similar to me. How can you, I think that's not a good representation. If we did this in London, let's put it up. I think that's what I wanted to say immediately. Thanks very much. That's great.
Right. So we have some time for questions from the audience. We have plenty of questions. This app, it's amazing. We've got 20 questions. We can choose the ones that I find interesting. So this subjective. But if there are no questions, I would like to pose a question, if I may. I found it really interesting that in your model, the type of experience the police didn't matter at all. It wasn't like a little bit, didn't matter at all. And maybe making too much out of it, but it strikes me as very fascinating because we'll always think that if we teach the police how to behave properly, it will change certain dimensions. So perhaps trust apparently is not one of those, but I find it striking because you would think that with a bit of training, we can improve the way that the police handle their suspects, and then by that, build legitimacy, potentially trust, respect, and so on. And based on these results, actually, it's not the important factor. It doesn't strike me as the important factor, which means that it's not just about what the police do. And because some of your findings show that it's not the propensity to trust, it's about trust as a group and so on, the things that Justice spoke about a little bit before as well. These are a wider question than what the police as an institution can do to change. It's far beyond that. Now, it poses a problem because, what do I do to change this? If I want the police or any other social institution to improve in terms of this trustworthiness and trust more specifically, then what is it that I can do with them? Because it doesn't strike me that the experience changes these sort of perceptions or dimensions. So what are we left to do operationally to change these?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting you picked up on that. I think that's an artifact of the model as well, and where we chose to put contact in the model. If we put it in earlier, it would have predicted trust, and then when you put trustworthiness, it would drop out. Essentially, I can't remember if it was quite that neat, but that's fully what I'd expect to happen. So if we'd have done a structural model, I definitely would have started with contacts on the left-hand side, then had trustworthiness, then had trust, and there would have been a big indirect effect. That's how I'd have thought. Yeah. It's being soaked up by experiences.
So at least themselves invested in the market structure contribution to life. It's not only about teaching them to do things, but teaching them what not to do. which can be important. And I think especially when we look at the history of the attempt to legitimize the new police in England, we learned from them. But a lot of the things that were few encourage the police to do, the things that we put together, making them impartial, making them effective, avoiding corruption, and so forth. But the claim is that the most decisive factor was the opening up of society, making it much more inclusive, that people now have a stake, right, in the economy, in the politics, and so forth. That was the design. So we tend to really isolate the police as an institution and say, well, people have particular views and vote. Let's train them to behave in a particular way, and that's going to fix the problem. Maybe the views for the police are just a reflection of some wider concerns that people have of the state and the being around the they have regular. This one.